Welcome to the Darren Well podcast with Rita Mercer.
We lose our trust in what our body's telling us. It's essentially like you have a really strong radio connection. You can hear everything. Maybe it's really loud, right? These are the sensations we're experiencing, but you're not trusting what you're hearing. You're not believing it. And so this is a really important key piece of how are we actually perceiving what's going on in the body? Because if we can't perceive it accurately, this is what moves into dysregulation and into a reactive state.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Darren Well podcast. Today, my guest is Rachel Korb. Rachel is a somatic leadership coach. Rachel is also specializing in supporting high-achieving women, leaders, and startup professionals. Rachel has over a decade of experience in senior leadership roles at remote startups and coaching. Rachel's focus is on supporting the unique needs of women's nervous systems, helping them to thrive in all parts of their lives. I'm excited for you guys to hear more about how we can learn how to feel less stressed, less overwhelmed, and less burnout by learning how to regulate our nervous system with less emotional reactivity. So again, thank you so much for joining the Darren Well podcast, Rachel. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Rita. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Yay! So as we think about your why, I love for guests to always share about their why because I think it's relevant to kind of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So share more about, you talked about body transformation. You talked about a lot of these different bouts of burnout that you experience. And I know we can all relate to burnout with stress in our lives. And so share more about that and how it leans into what you're doing now.
Yeah. So it really started with my career. I'm someone who's always been ambitious, and I moved into startups in San Francisco and early stage. So for anyone who's worked in early stage startups, there's never a dull moment. There's always something more to do, maybe 10, 20 things at a time. And so working in these roles, especially moving into senior leadership positions, there was just a lot of demand. And I ended up burning out 3 times. And so what's ironic about this is I had been practicing mindfulness, somatics, nervous system regulation since I was 19. So for about 15 years at that point. And what I didn't do was listen to myself. Or live what I knew through the mindfulness, through the somatics, through the nervous system regulation. And in my third bout of burnout, it was something I couldn't ignore anymore. I had insomnia, high functioning anxiety. I also had a breakout in shingles that was extremely painful. I couldn't breathe. That level. Yeah, that level. And so when I reached that point, there was this moment of I've achieved everything I've always wanted to achieve, but I'm not fulfilled. Is this really worth it? At the same time, my body was waging war, right? Internally, my body was saying, hey, this isn't sustainable anymore. And so this is really my why of how can we find a way that's sustainable in terms of our energy, in terms of fulfillment, in terms of really being honest with who we are and how we want to show up in this world. And a lot of that is, which we'll probably talk about today, is through the lens of the nervous system and what does it mean for female physiology and how is it a little bit different when we think about designing a life that we love from the inside out.
Wow, that's super cool. Yeah, I think as women, we push ourselves because we're such like nurturers and givers, and we try to do all the things, manage the family, manage things at the office, like manage our friendships and relationships. We're just trying to manage all the things, and sometimes we ignore us. And so I think that's really powerful, thinking about sustainable energy, sustainable in terms of lifestyle. And I love that question. Is it really worth it? Because sometimes I think we're going and going and going, and then we're not counting the costs that we're putting on our body, our mind, and sometimes when it's we don't notice until it's too late. And I think that's the scary part. So for people that are in leadership, and I think leadership maybe feels too, for some people that are not in like a C-suite level type of leader, they might feel like, okay, well, I'm not that kind of leader. But you're a leader in your community. You're a leader in your friend group. You're a leader in your home. You're a leader even without chief officer in front of your title. And so, thinking about leadership in various roles, how can women, especially women, how can they tune into this body awareness so that they can lead and live well?
Yeah, yeah, I love what you say about the leadership piece. I always say it's not a title, it's how we show up. And so it's really across all of these different facets. And so what can we do to lead well? So first is building something called interoception skills. This is our ability to really understand and read our internal landscape through our senses. Why this is so important for women is there's when you break it down, there's two elements. There's interoceptive accuracy and there's interoceptive awareness. So one is around, can I actually sense what's going on in the body, right? That's the interoceptive awareness. So the best way it's tested is through like being able to count our heartbeats without actually counting our pulse. But it's also thirst, hunger, shifts in maybe muscular tension. And then the other piece, interoceptive accuracy, is related to, do we trust it? And
Ooh, that's good.
yes, and with women or female physiology, it changes. So when we look at the first half of our infradian rhythm, so that's our menstrual cycle, what we normally call it, so follicular and ovulation, we have better awareness. Once we move into that luteal phase, especially late luteal phase, we lose our trust in what our body's telling us. It's essentially like you have a really strong radio connection. You can hear everything. Maybe it's really loud, right? These are the sensations we're experiencing, but you're not trusting what you're hearing. You're not believing it. And so this is a really important key piece of how are we actually perceiving what's going on in the body? Because if we can't perceive it accurately, this is what moves into dysregulation and into a reactive state. So that's one piece. The other, which I've touched on through this, is really becoming aware of our infradian rhythm, our menstrual cycle, and how that impacts us, how that impacts our nervous system's capacity, so that when we show up, we can show up differently. So this is, what are the practices that I use to regulate the nervous system, but also how do I design the way that I'm working? How am I designing my day? How am I choosing which relationships to cultivate when? So really pairing the two and understanding how they influence each other. So I'd say those would be my first two areas, is one, really getting to know the body, being able to interpret it effectively across the cycle, but then also bringing in the cycle to everything you do around the nervous system.
Wow. Is there any specific warning signs that people can notice about themselves if they're struggling with this accuracy and awareness? Because I think sometimes we know it, but we know it when it's too late. And
Yeah.
so how can they start to tune into their body with this awareness, with this accuracy, so they can learn to trust their body and trust what their body is telling them?
Yeah. So we all have unique stress patterns. And when we think about this, I'll give like a little geeky moment for a second. We have
Oh
our window
yeah.
of tolerance. So when we're in our window of tolerance, this is our social engagement system. This is when we're regulated. This is when we're the most calm, joyful, present, grounded, curious, open minded. But when we move out of it, we move into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So hyperarousal is fight or flight. For women, this can also show up as tend and befriend. So what you talked about of like putting others first, we do this, but it still has a negative impact on the nervous system when it's chronic. Hypoarousal is that freeze or shutdown, right? Numbness, withdrawal. These are the areas that we move into. So when we think about understanding our stress patterns, we need to identify, where am I moving? What's my default? Am I moving into hyperarousal? Am I moving into that fight or flight or tender befriend state? Or am I moving into hypoarousal, that freeze or shutdown state? So that's first, is understanding, what are those? What are the signals for them? Because they have unique signals. There's like a whole list for both. We won't go into it now. And there's like the physiological of what we notice in the body. And then there's the emotional and some of the mental pieces. So what I always recommend, and when I work with my clients, it's, let's get clear and start to map that out. So what is my default mode that I jump into? How does it start to manifest physically, emotionally, mentally? And where does it show up in the body? So we do a thing called body mind mapping where we start to connect and say you have like a really intense meeting. There's a lot of disagreement and you're just feeling yourself move into this fight or flight state, probably the fight state at this point. A lot of my clients are default fight state. You notice that your shoulders start to rise up, that you feel a knot in your chest, and then you connect it to the emotions of anger or frustration or something, right? Something else. So I think that's one piece is you need to build your own map and identify what are my stress patterns and understand what are the content or pardon me, what are the circumstances that lead to it. And then the second is building that awareness over time. So it's a skill. We develop it just like anything else. This comes through things like a body scan, consistent body scans. I always say with clients in the beginning, it can feel a little bit too much because the mind might be going. So it's just start with a 30-second pause when you wake up in the morning, just noticing what sensations am I feeling in the body? What energy do I have in the body? Where am I in my cycle right now? And what do I need for today? And so once we get into that, for example, like when we think about that trust piece, when we're in, if we notice like I'm in the luteal phase, you're like, okay, so what I'm telling myself, is this actually true? It's being able to be curious and question it, not from a skeptic standpoint, but just really understanding, okay, I'm noticing this knot in my chest. Is this due to something real that really matters? Or is it because right now I'm in my luteal phase and so it feels harder right now? So I think there are a couple pieces to it. There's like that foundational building out the skill set, but then also taking a moment to get curious and really question versus just automatically jump into that reactive response, which is what happens more often than not because of our nervous system capacity in the luteal stage.
Yeah, I like that, Rachel, because it sounds like a lot of grace with your body, grace with yourself, grace with whatever season your body is in for that month. Yeah, because we women are very unique with our bodies going through tons of changes. And so I'm curious about when you talked about putting others first, does that mean people pleasing or is that something totally different?
It could be people pleasing, it could be prioritizing others' needs above your own.
Mm,
So what happens on a physiological level is women, so men don't tend to have this, or male, I like to say male physiology, right? We're talking about sex, not gender. Male physiology functions differently. For female physiology, what happens is we move into this tend or befriend state. So this could be people pleasing, not setting boundaries is a big one, putting other people's needs ahead of our own, because this releases oxytocin in the body. So for us, it creates this more kind of calming effect, right? It helps us. And historically, the hypothesis or the theory is that this is what ensured survival for both the woman and her children. And the problem with this is, though, when we're constantly putting others' needs above our own or not setting boundaries or that people pleasing, we are still stressing the nervous system. It's in a chronic state where you might also have elevated cortisol in addition to the oxytocin. And so it does increase what's called allostatic load. And this is what prevents the body from moving back into that connection state, homeostasis, where we want the body to return to.
wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So when you think about women and how we need different strategies compared to the male physiology, so why does the standard mindfulness, why does that not come up to what we actually fully need? Like why does that
Yeah.
fall short for women?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple pieces for this. So first is we are cyclical, not linear, right? We've already established that. And so our
Hmm.
window of tolerance, as I mentioned, its ability to handle stress throughout the month shifts across the hormonal fluctuations that we have. So in that first half where you have higher levels of estrogen, your window of tolerance will probably be bigger. Your nervous system has higher capacity. Once we move past ovulation into the luteal and bleeding phases, that's where it's lower. And so mindfulness can be helpful, but it doesn't always work because a lot of the research has been focused on male physiology, so it's somewhat cycle blind. So I think there's something about that we need to be thinking about. How do our hormones really change the techniques and how they land in our body? And so an example of that is breath work. So maybe one practice to downregulate if you're in that fight or flight state and follicular will work really well. Whereas in your luteal phase, maybe it will actually trigger you a little bit more into a heightened state of dysregulation. And so we need to have some awareness of how that impacts it. Another example of that is like when we look at temperature. So there's this whole trend about like being in cold water and being submerged for X amount of time at a certain temperature. I can't remember what it is, but that temperature is actually bad for women, that because of how our body functions differently. So we need a higher temperature than what is normally recommended for cold bathing. And then also, once we move into luteal, what works better is warmth and pressure. And so we need to start thinking about what are these practices that we have. The other piece that I think when we talk about mindfulness, depending on the technique, right? There's a lot of different techniques. Is it more of a top-down approach? So is it a cognitive approach or is it a bottom-up, which is a body-first approach? When we're thinking about mindfulness, that top down approach is really helpful, but we need to start with the body first because if the body's dysregulated, our brain is offline and we can't access the parts that we need to actually work our way through it. So I think that's another piece that's really, really important to talk about. And so it's like that adaptability to the cycle as well as awareness of what order can help in terms of how can we really use the tools in the right order so that we're accessing what we need and like really serving the body and responding to the body the best way that it operates. Now that we know a lot more about neuroplasticity and neuroscience and physiology, we really need to leverage that a little bit more because it's not like a one size fits all approach. It's very tailored.
Gotcha. Is there any research that talks about like menopausal women, or is this just premenopausal based on the cycle, the
This
menstrual
is such
cycle?
a good question. Yeah.
Okay, I was just curious. I'm like,
So,
as you're talking about this, I'm like, for me, because I've had a lot of guests, I've probably had like maybe 6 guests or maybe 7 this year talking about perimenopause and menopause. And what was her name? Holly Berry came out. Maybe I think she came out maybe last year, maybe the year before, but just talking about it. And so I think it's bringing more awareness to women's issues. So it just made me just curious about like, does this apply and how does it apply to the women that are experiencing perimenopause and menopause?
yeah. So the short answer is there is very little to no research on perimenopause in the nervous
Mm,
system. The majority is for reproductive age. So as soon as you get your period until it leaves, what we do know is it does shift. So how our nervous system responds in pregnancy is different, how it responds in postpartum is different. And then perimenopause, we understand how it responds differently, but there hasn't been a lot of research around it. So, for example, once we hit perimenopause with all of kind of these peaks and valleys of the hormonal fluctuations, we find that perimenopausal women tend to experience more challenges with emotional regulation due to the nervous system capacity changing the way that it does. But that's really about it. I've scoured so many articles and have found very little information around perimenopause. But I do think that will likely be the next because the majority right now is for those who are menstruating. And then there is some secondary around pregnancy and postpartum and the impacts on the nervous system.
that's good to know. That's good to know. That's good to know what's on the radar because again, we women, we have so many things that we take care of, and learning to take care of our body is first and foremost that we should be like great at. And so as we start to wrap up, Rachel, what are some like practical mindset strategies that people can take today to implement into their well-being lifestyle, their work lifestyle, relationships? Like what are some practical ways that they can take when you think about regulating? I mean, you've actually given tons of ideas, so don't feel like you have to, I don't know, make up the same stuff. But I don't know if there's any other mindset strategies that people can do starting today.
Yeah. So What I would say is mindset strategies alone won't regulate your nervous system. If you try to think your way into regulation, it can tend to backfire and you can
Make it
dysregulate the nervous
worse.
system more. Yeah. So, for those who want to investigate it, like the vagus nerve sends 80% of information from the body up to the brain, not the other way around. So, what that means is the brain's constantly receiving these signals. Heart rate's elevated, breathing shallow, muscles tense. And then, based on this data, the brain then interprets, am I in safety or am I in danger? So, what we need to do is we need to start with the body, right? That
So
for me,
somatic.
mindset strategy number one is not mindset, it's body. Regulate the
Mm,
body, use the
yeah.
breath, movement, touch, sound. That's all really important. These will send signals to the brain saying, okay, we're safe, we're good. And then we can go back to the mindset strategies. Then, in terms of the second piece for those mindset strategies, it's just really having clarity of like, is it around perspective taking, reflection, reframing? Because once we've regulated the body, the prefrontal cortex has come back online. And so this allows us to move back into the logic brain. It allows us to emotionally regulate. And so this really is what enables us to access those mindset strategies. So I'd say mindset strategy is like part two. Part one is regulate the body first.
Yeah. So a bottom up approach. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Well, thank you for keeping it simple to help women specifically learn how to love themselves in every season of their life. So that's super awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for stopping by. What are some ways people can connect with you, and what are ways that you best serve them?
Yeah. So, best ways to connect with me. I'm not huge on social media. You'll probably see.
Me
It's
too.
not good for my nervous system, so I limit it.
There you
I'm
go.
yeah, right. So LinkedIn, just Rachel Korb. I also am on Substack under Coaching with Rachel, and then my website, rachelkorb.com, where I share a little bit more about my story, but I also offer some services. So I'm private coaching where I work with women, and then also, I have a program that I lead twice a year called Nervous System Mastery for Women, and really helping women understand how their nervous system works, why it's different, and then building out kind of that base toolkit. I always say this program is kind of like a starting point for a lifelong journey because the work that I do with my clients, it's not what is this overnight hack or quick fix. It's how can I really create long lasting change that starts from within? So that's a little bit about what I offer and also where you can find me.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, that's super great. That's super great because I think it is about lifestyle. It's not just, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of quick hacks out there that will get you a win, but it won't be sustainable.
Mm,
So,
exactly.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah, yeah. So cool. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing about ways that women can regulate their nervous system and why it's so important. I think that's the other thing. So, yeah, so tuning into your body. So, a lot of somatic things.
a
Awesome.
lot of somatic things. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. All right, friends, that's all for today. Thank you so much for stopping by the Darren Well podcast. Don't forget to like, to share, and subscribe wherever you may hear this episode. So, wishing you a fabulous day, my dear. Until next time, keep living, keep loving, and keep daring well. Take care, guys. God bless. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Daring Well podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to continue exploring the world of holistic wellness, be sure to subscribe to the Daring Well podcast so you never miss an episode filled with transformative conversations and actionable advice. Thank you again for being part of the Daring Well podcast community. Together, let's dare to live well in mind, body, and spirit.